some of our people are joining in, please can I just kindly ask the HODs to please send a reminder on their respective church platforms. It might be that some people came back from shift and maybe they are still resting, or they just need a little bit of nudge to join us. Let them know that we have started the session and we'll go right into it now. Okay. This morning we're having a training on data security and data privacy and data protection issues. We've been talking about it in church to remind us how important it is that in a country like this, where we're governed by policies and laws and we need to ensure compliance to such, we have then put up this training. So we want to say a massive thank you to Pastor Sam, who really emphasized the need for us to have this kind of training opportunity. But not just that, Pastor Sam has also gone ahead to make arrangements with someone, and it will interest you to know that he's also one of us. He has been part of us and he still remains one of us. So we're so privileged to have him. His name is Dr. Paul Abba. He's a lecturer and a doctor of law, if I'm correct, and he lectures at the School of Economics, Law, and Business, or is that what it's called? School of Business.
Business Education and Law. Yeah.
Business Education and Law. Thank you, sir. Apologies for that. Just to make sure. At the University of Huddersfield, and he's going to be taking us through some of the things to cover. But I just like to quickly run us through how the session will go this morning, and then we'll dive into it. So we're going to start with, we don't want to waste too much time. We've got 2 hours. We're going to start with the speaker himself going straight into the lecture. We want to have a bit of break. So maybe after about 45 minutes, let's take about 10 minutes for health break, and then people can sort of stretch their legs or get a cup of coffee, and then we'll come back. But we'll do it this way. Please, when it is time for that break, I will come back and inform us. Please leave your hands up once you are going on break. Once you come back, just lower the hand. That will let us know how many people are back. And if nobody has, if your hand is still up, then we'll know that you have not returned from the break. We want to keep it at 10 minutes. So please, let's pay attention to that. So on the session, we're going to be talking about laws relating to data processing for church members. We're going to talk about photography, video recordings, live recording of sessions during service, gift aids envelope, other forms of forms that we use in collecting and processing data. But more particularly for things that we also use for government reporting, like HMRC reporting. We're going to talk about church members who are no longer, with us, ex-church members. What do we do in terms of data retention policies? Then vis-a-vis the rights of those members. We're also going to talk about, when we want to streamline forms, to what extent do we go regarding informed consent? And under what circumstances, do we need informed consent? And are there situations where we don't necessarily need them? And you'd agree with me that there are cases where we've had in church where these things become really relevant. And then we're going to talk about church policies around CCTV as well. I'll be handing over to the speaker now, but please, if during the session you have your questions, you can just put them in the chat box. So we'll do 45 minutes, take a short break, come back again, and then do another 45 or maybe 30 minutes. And then we'll give about 30 minutes, the last half hour of the session from around 11:30, we'll keep it for questions. So if you have put your questions in the chat, we'll come back to those questions and take them one after the other. Just so you don't forget, if it's talking about anything and you have a question, you can just put it in the chat box and then we'll come back to them after the call. So thank you once again, everybody, for joining. I'll now hand it over to our guest lecturer, Dr. Paul Abba, to have the floor. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this. I'll call it a brief talk, even though it's not that brief. So it's a privilege for me to present this talk as the as he mentioned, I was a member of Rccg Exeter for I think over 5 years while I was in my PhD in Exeter. I think I left in 2019 after like 5 years. So and during those 5 years, it was a privilege to attend Rccg, and church was quite helpful to me throughout. So when Pastor Sam contacted me, I was like, of course, I'm happy to contribute to give back to the church that has been there for me. Okay, so the talk that we'll be having, that I'll be presenting today, would be on data protection generally. Even though when we say data protection, it's much wider than just data. It includes things like gift aid, CCTV usage, live streaming, online video. We would cover all of those in our discussion today. So and as I discussed with Pastor Sammy, for now, the presentation that I would make, I would have it available to share after the session, so you can look back at it. I actually have a PowerPoint slide and a Word document that contains far more content than the PowerPoint slide, because the whole aim is not just to talk to you about it, is to actually have you learn these important concepts that we will cover. And as you all know, the laws in this country are very strict. There are very few things that you can get away with. And particularly the church as a charity is strictly regulated by the Charity Commission. And, there can be very serious consequences where there are breaches, and the breaches may not even need to be by the head pastor. It could even be by any form of senior managers or officials of the church. So it's important that everyone goes away from this talk not just knowing the key principles, but really understanding it. And so I have dedicated like 30 minutes at the end of the discussion to just questions and answer. And please feel free to ask any questions you want, or any issues that you want to clarify. I may not cover every single thing that you're thinking about, because my task today is to give you an overview of data protection, how it works, what the law is, and I'll be focusing mostly on the practical steps that the church can take to comply. So I'll just share my slide. So I've made a brief slide on it. So let me just confirm. Yes. Okay, I hope you can all see the slide.
Yes, sir. Now we can see.
Let me just make it big. Okay, so we'll be looking at data protection, and as I said, it's much bigger than that. And now, don't be scared by all the things that I have listed here that we're going to cover. We will break it into 2 sessions. So after the first 45 minutes, we will take a 10 minutes break, and then we will come back and cover the rest of the areas, and we would then have 30 minutes at the end for all of your questions. So if you have any questions, you can just note them down, so that we can come back to them to discuss. So we'll be looking at, first of all, how data protection operates in a church context. I mean, we know data protection for universities, for businesses, but in a church context, how does it apply? We'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at data collection and processing, but most importantly, we'll be looking at informed consent. So I can't stress enough that informed consent is at the heart of data protection, because where informed consent is not obtained, the church could get into some really serious legal problems. So we'll be covering informed consent in a bit more depth than the other subject. So we will also look at CCTV policy, gift aid, photos and videos, data retention. We would cover all of those, but we'll be focusing mostly on data collection and then informed consent, because those are the 2 key areas where the church could easily fall foul of the law on it. Okay. So the purpose of the talk is to explore, how we can handle data responsibly, but most importantly, to ensure compliance with UK laws. Now, while doing that, we also want to honor Christian values because the church is a representation of Christ. So while we're trying to comply with the law, we also want to make sure that we do not deviate from our core value of, propagating the gospel, of making members feel respected, of creating a community of Jesus Christ. So it's that balance between complying with the law and propagating Christianity. It's that delicate balance that we'll be looking at today. Okay, so now one thing I have to stress from the start is I know I was introduced as a senior lecturer in law. Yes, I'm a senior lecturer in law, but I've also been a practicing solicitor for the past 4 years. I think since 2021. Yeah, so I became a solicitor in 2021, and my expertise is in civil matters. And I specialize mostly in areas relating to data protection, charity law, education, things like that. So when Pastor Sam contacted me, I was like, oh, coincidentally, that's really my area. Now, I also do other areas like employment, immigration, but I tend to do data protection issues quite a number of times, and I've just identified there, of a few cases which I've been involved in West Yorkshire. So I'm based in Sheffield, which is in Yorkshire area. And just this year, we actually had a data protection case against a school in West Yorkshire for mishandling a child's data. It looked like a very minor issue. I mean, it just they they just left as one of the senior managers just left her computer screen on, which had the students' education result, and it became a very big issue. And the school had to compensate the child with thousands of pounds, over £10,000 compensation. So it could get very serious, where data protection regulations are not complied with. And we just also completed a case against University of Sheffield for data protection issues. And I mean, we have a couple of charity organizations that we represent, and we regularly have to advise them on how to comply with the data protection regulations when it comes to charity. So I would bring all of those expertise in my discussions today, and I'll try to be as practical as possible while also covering the scope of what we expect in this talk. Now, so the first question is, as a church, why does data protection matter? And I've had a few people ask me that, well, Christians just go to church to pray, sing hymns, and go home. I was like, yes, but there's far more to a church than that. For a church, data protection covers things like prayer requests, membership details, photos taken during church sessions, videos. All of these are data which date is governed by the law. I would look at the legal provisions shortly, but so all of these are important sensitive information. We call them sensitive information because they are personal information. For instance, a church member is coming to pray to say, oh, she wants she and her husband have been struggling for a child for several years, and her prayer request is for the fruit of the womb. Now, that may look like a standard thing we see in churches, but that information that she has shared is a sensitive information. If that information is disclosed without informed consent, then the church could really get into some legal troubles, because those are deemed to be sensitive information. Not only do they classify as medical information, they also, they're also classified as private details of a church member. So there are several sensitive information which get disclosed as part of the church activities. We will look at that quite briefly. But so the potential risk for the church is it could cause harm to church members. Yes, believe it or not, it could cause harm to church members. There could be stigma arising from it. There could be church members feeling ostracized, knowing that, oh, everybody know my private information. And it could really damage the trust within the church community. We often hear about issues going on in churches where you have groups of people who are bickering against each other. That would not foster a Christian community. So data protection is important because it helps to foster trust. So members know that whatever information they divulge, it's safe. And of course, the biggest one is the legal penalties. So beyond just the other social and religious consequences, there could be serious legal penalties, which we would look at quite briefly. Okay, so I will first look at data collection. I'll then look at informed consent. We will look at CCTV, gift aid, photos, video, and we will end up by looking at how to retain data of members. And I think the earlier speaker did mention that how about former members? Now, for former members, the main data protection concern will be retaining their data, which includes me, for instance. So it's been over, let's say, it's been almost 5 years since I left Exeter. The question is, if I contact the church now to say, look, I want to have all the data that you had on me while I was there, can the church provide it? Is the church legally obliged to provide it? What if they no longer have it? Would that be a legal problem for the church? Or are they entitled to delete all my information shortly after I leave? So we would cover these points because the church has to know the scope of its legal responsibilities under the law. And where there's a breach, not only with the church being serious legal troubles, it could actually get the Charity Commission involved. Okay, so let's look at the key laws. I won't bore you with legal details, but yes. So the key laws are the GDPR. I'm sure you must have heard of GDPR of 2018. So it's a European Union regulation which continues to apply in the UK after Brexit. But within the UK itself, we have the Data Protection Act of 2018, which aligns UK law with the GDPR. And most importantly, it has specific provisions for charities like churches. So I will be covering some of those provisions as we go on, right? Now, what do these laws cover? They cover collection, storage, use, and disposal. So these are the four main aspects of data protection. How do you collect data? How do you store it? How do you use it after collecting it? And then finally, how do you dispose of those personal data? So we call them the four aspects of data protection. So we will try to cover as much of it as possible. But I must warn that I won't get too much into the technical bits. I will try to focus more on the practical aspects of how we can use this information about data protection. So examples of data that church collects are names, addresses, prayer requests, health details, all of these points. Now, what is the relevance of data protection law to Rccg, Exeter? Right? One is, obviously it includes collection of sensitive data, but it also has that African cultural practice. Now, one thing I have noticed is, when I first moved over to Exeter, I couldn't find an RCC church here. So I had attended a few white churches, and the practice they have is totally different from the way African churches operate. Now, so the problem is that a lot of the African cultural practices that we have would not fit within the data protection regulations that apply here. For instance, when during testimony time, I mean, I've never seen a testimony time in any of the churches I attended, but during testimony time, you have a church member comes up and say, "Oh, I was looking for the fruit of the womb for 5 years, for 10 years." Yeah, and she's saying this to the whole church. The question is that those are private information that she's sharing. Yeah, of course, within the African cultural setting, that's a normal thing. But how would the church manage such information? Because she is probably saying doing that based on her experience of how African churches operate. That's the only thing she knows. But for the church has to be mindful of the fact that such information, if it spreads wider outside the church, it could create legal problems for the church. So we've advised a couple of churches here about how to streamline even their testimony time. I had to advise one of the churches here to say, look, your testimony time, you probably would have to streamline it a bit just to comply with data protection, such that, we can start using things like anonymized testimony form, where people don't know who is giving the testimony, but we still get the testimony because let's be honest, testimony is important. It boosts the faith of people, but at the same time, you also want to protect the identity of the person giving the testimony. So, these are some of the steps that the church may need to consider when it in order to fully comply with data protection regulations, right? And it doesn't mean that you can't have like open testimony time. It then comes down to what we talked about, informed consent, to say if you're going to continue those kind of practices, then whoever the testimony giver is would have to have been given informed consent to say, look, if you were to share your information publicly to the church, you're consenting to the fact that this information becomes publicly known, and the church cannot guarantee that the information will not spread wider beyond the church. Because, I mean, if you give a testimony to 20, 30 people, these people are going to go tell their friends will tell their neighbors, things like that. And you can't hold the church responsible. Only if the church has followed the informed consent procedure, where the member has accepted that he or she is willing to divulge this information publicly and understands the consequence of divulging such information. So those are some of the things that we have to look at when it comes to data protection within our African cultural practices. So as I said, as you can see there, so sharing prayer requests or testimony openly may need some form of adjustment. Now, if you don't want to make the adjustment, then you may have to use like some forms where such persons, before they share it publicly, will have to fill the form to say they are given informed consent for such information to be publicly divulged. Things like that, just to keep the church safe within legal boundaries. Even taking photos, videos. During praise and worship, you have lots of photos and videos taken. Those are normal. Those are fine. But the question now is, how do you obtain informed consent of the members to take their photos and videos? But most importantly, how do you retain those photos and videos which you have taken? So, there are several legal obligations that the church has as a registered charity under UK law. Now, first of all, let's look at the legal consequence if the church does not comply. Of course, the most important is financial penalties. Now, I'm not sure the church doesn't make 17.5 million pounds a year, but that's just the maximum. But the important point is the church could be fined up to 4% of its annual turnover. And so it's quite a serious thing. We've had a couple of charities who have been fined millions of pounds. Of course, much larger charities for non-compliance, but also there's reputational damage to the church. If there's a case of non-compliance, the charity commission would have to get involved, and the charity commission would actually they have a register of non-compliant charities, so the church could find its name in the black book, so to say, right? And of course, there'll be loss of trust, emotional harm to members, and so it could get quite serious. But in all of this, we also want to acknowledge the cultural tendencies of we Africans, of how we, use information. But the key thing is we have to learn to modify those practices to comply with data protection regulations. Okay, so that's just a general overview of what we are looking at here as a church when it comes to data protection. So let's start with the first aspect of it. Let's look at data collection and retention. So this has to do with how do you collect data from members, and how do you retain those data when you collect it. Now, the first thing is data protection regulations cover what we call personal data. So personal data, what is personal data? It doesn't cover things like the church address, the information of the pastor, as in who the pastor is, the church address, the registration status of the church. Those are not personal data. So what is personal data? Personal data under the law refers to any information that identifies a person. So data protection laws governs personal information, which is it must be tied to a specific individual, right? So let me give an example. we once had an issue where a church had to contact us for advice on it. There was a dispute among some of the members in the church. And the question was, some of the members wanted information from the church about who are the people managing the finances of the church. And the church said, well, that is data protection issue. And we said, well, not really. It's not really a data protection issue because the information that the church members are requesting is not personal data. This is data about management of the church. And as a charity, as a registered charity, these are information that has to be publicly available to the members, right? So even though the information they are requesting has to do with names, but the names they are requesting is not to specifically identify a person, but to identify a group that manage the church. So that will not classify as personal data. So what the law governs as regards as personal data is data that identifies a specific person. So the name of the person, the email, the phone number, the address, their family members, any form of information has to do with a specific individual as an individual, not as an official, but as an individual. Now, the law goes further to say, look, there are some categories of personal data that we deem special category, right? So these are special personal data. And as you can see, the health of individuals is deemed as special category data, which is why I gave the example of a woman giving testimony about being barren for a few years. That is a special category data. Why is it special category? Because a breach of such data carries far more consequence than just name, email address, or phone number. So things like the health of a person, the person's faith, which will probably not be much of a problem for a church, because if you're in church, clearly your faith is Christianity, right? So mostly for churches, the main thing we advise about when it comes to special category is the health of members. So when members are coming to give testimony, oh, I had fibroid, I prayed, and the fibroid, and God healed the fibroid, good. But that information is a special category information. So the church has to treat it with some real special care, because if there's a breach there, the church would get in far more trouble than if it just discloses a person's name and information, which is why we always have to focus on testimony time and prayer request, because that's where you get lots of health issues arising. Okay, so how do the church as in collect data? There are several ways that the church collect data. Membership forms. I'm not sure if Rccg Exeter has membership forms. Sorry, Pastor, if I can just start, do you have like forms that you have to fill to be a member?
Yes, sir. We have forms for first timers,
First
which then
timers,
makes
okay.
them join the church as
Yeah.
members.
Yeah, because sorry, I can't remember filling the form. So
Sir.
maybe I feel it when the first time I went, which must have been so many years ago, right? Okay, so yeah, so that form, that first timers form, is a membership form. So they would have provided their names, address, and contact details. The information that they've provided there is their personal data. So the church would have to manage it in terms of retention policy, which we would look at. Now, other forms of data that the church collects is prayer request, which is, as I said, it's a special category data because it mostly has to do with health issues. Family issues is not really special category, but it's still an important one. Now, children's records, we would also look at it briefly, because whenever the church has to deal with any information regarding children, the church must obtain consent from the parents, right? So we will look at it, because children cannot give informed consent. And by child, we mean anyone below 13, not really below 18, but below 13 under the data protection regulations. But we would come to those points later. Now, there's one key thing which most churches don't consider: allergies. Now, we know that as part of church services, they sometimes share food, right? Share food. Maybe someone is doing naming ceremony or child dedication. It's a purely African thing, right? Okay, so we have like child dedication, naming ceremony, or we congregate at the member's house to celebrate house opening or something, and then food is shared. For most of us Africans, we don't think anything about it, like free food, jollof rice, party jollof rice. We all eat meat and go home. But it's important that the church collects data on allergies because, I mean, I know most Africans will not have allergy issues, right? It seems to be mostly for Caucasians, but it's still important because, God forbid, a child has an allergy to, I'm not sure, maybe peanuts. It's quite of is one of the most common allergies that children here have. And then we've shared granuts, and the child eats granite and goes into a shock, as medical shock. The question which the police would have to investigate would be, what data did the church collect on allergies? And the church would be like, well, we didn't think about it. That's a problem, right? Because the church would get reported to the Charity Commission for not complying with the data protection. So one thing that churches would have to do is they have to collect data on allergies. Now you ask, how do we do this? Right? It's quite, is it practical for us to do this? Yes, it is practical in the sense that you don't have to collect allergies for every single member at every single point. One thing that churches sometimes do, which we advise, is as part of your membership forms, you should include some information which the church member would provide about having any allergies, right? But most importantly, any event that the church is going to organize which involves some form of food sharing, the church should normally request, as in they will normally have, I mean, there are different ways they can do it, but simply to put out the information there that if you have any allergies, you should let us know. Prior to this food being distributed. Now, this may not seem like a big issue because most African children don't have allergies. I can imagine having allergies as a child. I just wanted to eat everything. Most African children are the same. So it's mostly more of a Caucasian issue. But as a church expands, I think we should have like some Caucasian members. So, and even I've seen a few, Black children these days who have allergies. Clearly, those born here, grew up here, they seem to, imbibe some of these allergies. So it's something that the church should have to consider about, whenever it involves any form of food sharing, you should make inquiries about allergies just to play it safe, right? Okay. Other form of data that the church would sometimes collect is about gift aid, and gift aid is an important aspect. We will come to that when offerings and tithes. Now, that's one area that we will have to cover because the typical African way of doing it, you just give your offering, give your tithe. That's fine. The truth is, there's really no data protection issue per se when it comes to offering and tithe because most times you just drop money, right? You drop money in the offering box and the rest. No one knows who has dropped what. So there's no personal data involved. However, most churches, and I don't know if Rccg is doing it, most churches these days begin to use envelope that they will pass around, that they will distribute. You have to fill, some churches pay, you can pay with your debit card or things like that. Now, once you get to that level where someone is beginning to provide like their debit card number and the rest, then data protection issues coming. So we then have to look at informed consent. Now, it's important that the church actually even considers doing that because of the gift aid point, which we would cover because it's an important step for the church. But we would look at that. Okay, now that we've dealt with the way that the church can collect data, let's then look at processing of data. So, what do we mean by processing data? As I said, there are 4 steps to data collection and to data protection: collecting it, retaining it, using it, and disposing of it. So, processing data is about using it. So we have covered collection. We have briefly talked about retention, even though I would come back to that. But let's talk about processing, which is using the data that has been collected. Now, this is where most times churches get into legal difficulties because the whole purpose of collecting the data is to use it, right? You don't just collect it so you can look at it and say, oh, we have 50 members. Most times you want to reach out to the members. For instance, you have night vigil coming up. You want to send out a mass, bulk messages to members. In doing so, you are using their personal data because you are sending the information to their mobile numbers, which you have collected, right? So by sending that information for a night vigil, you are processing their data because you are using it. Now, What is the lawful basis for the church to use the data collected by members? So you have membership from first-time members. They have filled their data, their name, their address, their phone number, and the rest. Now, quite understandably, you want to reach out to them after the church to greet them, see how they're doing, right? That is called processing their data because you are using their data to get in contact with them. So the lawful basis for a church to use the data of members are two. One, consent. The church must obtain the consent of members to use it. And for that, we say you must obtain the explicit permission from the individual. So in your membership form, I don't know how your membership form look like, but I know the couple of charities that we've advised, there must always be a column there where you ask the members for their consent to use the information that they have provided. So they must tick there. You can't just assume. Or what some charities used to do is they'll just put at the bottom that by completing this form you are consenting to us using your information. But the courts have said, I mean, there was a case and the court said it is not sufficient. You're simply telling them. You're not asking them, right? You can't just tell them by filling this form you have agreed. No, that's a bad bargaining strategy. Instead, there must be a box where the member would tick to say, I agree. I mean, we see that in website terms and conditions. You must tick to say, I agree to the terms and conditions. The same thing for churches. The information that you obtain from the members, there must be a column for the members to tick or select that they consent to the information being used. So in the membership form, for instance, you must have that. In the gift aid form, you must have that. In any envelope where that you are distributing for them to put tithe, offering, and the rest. And so long as any form of personal information is disclosed, because I mean, for most offering envelope, you literally don't have to put your name; you just put your money inside and drop it in the offering box. That is fine. You don't need any form of you don't need any form of consent for that because there's no personal data involved. But in any way that the member has to write his name or his phone number or email address or even credit card details, then you begin to collect their personal data. So you must get their consent, right? So that's something you must do. And the church should not get to a point where it is sending out marketing emails or text messages or WhatsApp messages without having obtained the consent of the members for their phone numbers to be used to contact them. So if it's something that the church doesn't have, perhaps it's that stage where the church should look at creating another document for members, even current members, to sign to say we consent to our information being used to contact us, right? And then secondly, the church can only use those information for legitimate interests. So you must show that you are using the information in order to further the church operations. Now that's normally not a problem because I mean most times when you contact church members is to notify them of night vigil, naming ceremony, and the rest. So that those will be legitimate interest, right? Okay, so as I said, these are legal obligations that the church must fulfill, and and it could actually even benefit the church when it comes to gift aid reclaims. Okay, now as part of data processing, we also have to look at the cultural considerations. You know how Africans we operate, right? That we divulge as much information as possible. We share information about, oh, did you know that brother John, him and his wife are going through a divorce? Things like that. Or brother John, his mother-in-law just came. We are quite used to sharing this kind of information. It's a way of building trust, right? Yes, but for the church, it must make sure that at least it's officials. I mean, you can't control how the members share information amongst themselves. But as a church and the officials, they must explain to the officials the importance of GDPR requirements to say you don't disclose information of members to others. For instance, a church member calls and says, Pastor Sam, you know that sister who came to church the other day? Please, can you give me a house address? I want to go and see her. And I learned that she just gave birth. Now, that may look like a normal thing, like, oh, I mean, this sister wants to go and visit the other sister that gave birth. But you have to think about it. If you're providing that address to that sister who wants to go visit, you're sharing the data of the person who she's going to visit. That becomes a GDPR issue. Do you have the consent of the member to do so. Now, in that kind of impromptu thing, two things come up. One, which the church should have foreseen ahead, is if the church has had some form of some form which members have completed to say we consent to our data being shared to other members for church activities, then fine, you already have a legal basis to share it. If that is not the case, then the pastor or whoever the official is or whoever the manager is who is involved here would have to contact the person whose data they are seeking to ask for their consent to say, look, this person wants your data, wants this data about you. Do you consent to it? And it should not just be a phone call. Yeah, and that's one point I have to always mention, that you have to begin to think about record keeping when it comes to data protection, right? So such things should not be calling the sister up. Even something as basic as WhatsApp chat, because at least you have a record of it to say, oh, this person wants your data, do you consent to it? So that if tomorrow something happens and the person says, oh, pastor will share my data, pastor will say, look, here's my correspondence with the sister, and she gave consent. So when we say obtaining consent, it doesn't mean that it must be in a written form, signed, sealed, and delivered. No, any form of written consent would do. Now, oral consent would also suffice, but there's a problem of proof. How do you prove it? If the sister denies giving the consent, how do you contradict that? So it's always important to obtain prior consent before sharing data. As I said, particularly the challenge is for African communities, we don't tend to pay so much attention to these things, but as a church, it must pay attention to it. And as leaders in the church, or as officials in the church, these are things that you must imbibe, right? You must imbibe it. And as I said, explicit consent is necessary. You cannot assume it. You cannot say, oh, that sister has been going through a lot. She said, that she wouldn't mind church members coming to visit her. That is an assumption. Even if she has said that, before you share her data, you must contact her and say, look, we're about to share this data about you. Do you consent to it? Now, it may not create any problem initially, but further down the line, if a question ever arises as to how you have processed or utilized her data, and you don't have proof of explicit consent, then you're going to be in some legal troubles, right? Okay. Other issues that we have about African communities is collecting unnecessary data. So a church member has come, and in the form you say, oh, how old are you? Do your parents live in the UK? The question is, how is that relevant? Now, it may be relevant, but the church has to be able to justify the information that they're collecting from members. So don't just, how we Africans, when we are discussing, we ask so many information from each other. It may be fine, but as a church, you have to know that you're operating within strict legal boundaries. So the information that the church collects must be relevant information. Avoid collecting unnecessary information. But I would leave that for the church members, for the church officials to decide what is relevant and what is not relevant. I mean, there might be some information which may not appear relevant on the face of it, but there might be much broader objectives behind it. That is fine, so long as the church can justify why it is collecting that data. Okay, so let's talk about practical steps then. I have identified the key issues. But what are the practical steps that the court can take to ensure that it complies with data protection when it comes to utilizing membership data? One is to use clear and simple forms. So it's always important that the membership form or whatever form that the church uses is very clear and simple. Avoid any complex or legal technicalities there. And the form should state why it's being collected and how it should be used. It doesn't have to be detailed. It's just normally one line. You normally see that in websites to say data collected is used for blah blah blah. For the church, you can say it's used for religious purposes, contacting members, things like that. But just briefly state, it normally is at the bottom in tiny print. Just okay, this is why data has been collected, and this is how it will be used. Right? We do that even as a solicitor. When I send emails, my email signature has like 3, 4 or 4 paragraphs explaining why I'll be collecting your data, how I'm going to use your data. So it's something that the church should use. I mean, if the church, I don't know, does the church have its own designated email address? Yeah. Ayo, sorry. Does the church have a designated email address?
Yes, Dr. Abba, there is.
Okay. So, and do the senior members of the church have their email address as in tied to the church address? So maybe like John at Rccg Exeter. Do we have something like that?
No, we don't like that.
Okay, so just the church's own email address. So in the email address that the church uses, the signature there should have data protection details to say your data has been collected for this is why the data will be used. So those are like practical steps that the church can use so that anyone sending an email to the church email address knows it can see from the signature. I mean, first of all, the email address should have like automatic reply. Yeah, if a member sends an email to the church, it gives an automatic reply saying your email has been received, it will be treated within so time, blah blah blah. But most importantly, it then has the data protection, requirement saying your data will be collected for this, and this is how your data will be used. So it gives members an advance notice that look, whatever information that you're sharing will be used for this purpose and that purpose. Okay. Beyond that, most churches and these days appoint what we call a data protection officer. Now, it's a legal requirement, but for churches, that requirement is a bit watered down. But nonetheless, it's best practice to have a data protection officer. So that officer, his or her main task is to continually review the church data protection policies to say, okay, looking through the forms that the church use, looking through the pictures, the videos, just to ensure that at all point the church is complying with data protection policies. So that's one important takeaway from now to say the church should appoint a data protection officer who will be specially trained further. I mean, what I'm providing here is a general overview of it, but there may be need to have like some additional training on that. And I'm happy to send whoever is appointed some additional, key resources, or maybe we'll have like a couple of meetings with the person to bring the person up to speed on some intricate details, because I can't go into all of the details today. But yes, that's an important step, to have a data protection officer, a DPO, who would continually review the church policy and ensure that the church is in compliance. And of course, train key personnel. And I'm happy that we're having this session today. It's a form of training. But if the church wants to organize as in subsequent trainings, I'm also happy to assist with that. Okay, so I've put here that there's a data breach story which we encountered. I think that was in 2023, where as one of the churches it's an African church. I won't say what the church is, but they had a membership list of their members, which was left inside. I think it was one of their senior official inside his car on the dashboard. So we had, as in, a couple of other members who took pictures of it, and then it became a real big issue. At first, the church was trying to bravado their way through and say, "Oh, it's not a big deal." But we then advised them that, look, if this matter is reported to the Charity Commission, you're in big trouble. That's serious data protection breach. So these are things that the church will have to be aware of. That yes, it has to have a membership list, but that membership list has to be kept securely. It's not something that should be divulged quite easily. Okay, briefly before we go on break, we'll take a 10 minutes break after this. Let's look at informed consent, because at the end of the day, everything that the church does when it comes to data protection has to do with the informed consent of the members. Okay, so what is informed consent? Consent is not the same thing as informed consent. Consent is simply telling somebody, do you agree to this? The person says yes. But when you ask the person, what have you agreed to? The person will be like, I don't know. You said, do I agree to my data? Yeah, I agree. Now, that's a problem because the person has not given informed consent. So what is informed consent? Informed consent is it must be freely given, but most importantly, it must be specific. So informed consent means the person must have information about what he or she is consenting to, which is why when you have a membership form or any other form that you are collecting consent from the members, it must be clear what they are consenting to. So by completing this form, you're consenting to your data, your information, blah, 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 being shared with members, being used for marketing, being used for communication, specific purposes. So that's how to obtain informed consent. It must be specific, it must be informed, right? Informed means you must tell them what the data has been collected for before they can consent to it. And of course, it must be unambiguous. Now, and the important thing is individuals can withdraw their consent at any time. You must always have that in mind. Of course, this is very rarely done, but if at any point any member says, look, it could be orally, it could be by WhatsApp message or to any official to say, look, I don't want my phone number being shared. That's withdrawal of consent. It must be respected. And these are things that the DPO, so the data protection officer, would have to continually revise. Say, what is our policy on withdrawal of consent? How do we manage withdrawal of consent? If a member said, I don't want this being shared, whoever the members told it to. Of course, now I must warn that you can't really regulate how members share information with each other, But as a church and the officials of the church, that's what we are dealing with. So if a member has informed any official, that official must then communicate it to the data protection officer to say, look, this member has said he doesn't want this shared. So that data protection officer would then note it on whatever system they have. And so whenever they are maybe sending out broadcast messages to other members, you don't send it to that member because the member has withdrawn consent. So but if you don't have a DPO, it's going to be difficult to manage distance. Okay, so that's what informed consent is. It must be specific, there must be ability to withdraw it. Then there must be a clear privacy notice. So I've covered this before, that in the forms and the rest, you must explain what is being collected, why it is being collected, and how it is used. Very briefly, you don't have to spend paragraphs, just very briefly in tiny prints. And of course, you must have explicit consent for sensitive data, particularly prayer requests, testimonies. You must have explicit consent for them. And then for children, I said, so under the law, for any person under 13, you can't get the person's consent directly. You must obtain the consent from the parents, right? So the question is, I'm not sure how the children's church is organized. I'm not sure how it is, but you must know that whoever is leading that section, in order to get consent from the children who are there to share their data, it must be obtained from the parents. So you may have forms where the parents would fill for each child, and the parent would have to tick or sign that they are giving consent for their children's information, pictures, videos, whatever to be used. But so that's the point, that for children, the consent must be obtained from the parents, right? So I have looked at like specific scenarios where we could where we deal with informed consent. So things like prayer requests. As I said, it's advisable that you have a form where members, if you still want members to announce their prayer request openly, I'm not sure that is being done, but if there's a form where members write out their prayer request, that must have informed consent on it. Tell them, you must indicate how the information will be used, blah, blah, blah. To pray for them, of course. Yeah, but you must tell them this is how the information will be used, and they must sign or tick to show their consent to it, right? And even before you include it in any newsletters, membership lists, marketing, events, you must have consent. Now, for marketing, you don't have to get consent every time you have to turn out the marketing email. It's about at the point that the members register their information, you obtain their consent, explicitly informing them that the information that they're providing would be used for marketing, to contact them or, to send emails about events, text fundraising, all of these points. So those are the key points about informed consent. And as I've said, I've always tried to look at it within the cultural consideration that we're Africans. The way we do things is slightly different. So you must be aware that the culturally members don't see this as a big deal. So it's part of the church to lead the enlightenment on this, to say not only as a church should we respect the data of others, even as members, you should respect the data of others. So do not, be careful when sharing sensitive information about fellow members. Now, of course, if a member breaches the data of another member, the church won't be responsible, so long as that member is not an official of the church. But it helps as a church to maintain trust and confidence that members are made aware about the need for data protection, even amongst each other, right? Because members may feel obligated. Let's say Sister Joy calls Sister Faith to say, please give me Sister Mercy's number. I mean, she might think, oh, that's fine. That's something that they do all the time. But it's something that the church may consider how to enlighten members about respecting the data of others, and emphasizing to members that consent to share data is important before it can be shared. And as I've said there, the pastors and leaders of the church should model this practice. So because for members, you can't instruct them about it. Of course, for the church officials, you can, but for members, it's about leading by example, enlightening them and showing how consent practices should be followed when it comes to data protection. Okay, so we will take a break here. I've included like some practical steps that the church can take, like consent forms, privacy notice, easy opt-out options, and you could have like a sample consent form which I could provide. And so as I've said, if the church needs one, I'm happy to prepare one. We have the ones that we use for some of our clients. So if it's something that I am willing to assist with. Okay, so let's take a break at this point, and then when we come back, very briefly, we will look at other things like CCTV policy, live streaming, gift aid. Any questions? Okay, well, we have a question and answer section at the end.
Thank you very much, sir. So we'll be back 11:10. When we come back, let's not worry about raising us. When we come back, those that are back, just let us know so we know. But we'll continue exactly 11:10. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, sir.
All right.
Okay. Just checking around the room. Do we have anyone who is back? If you're back, can you please just give a thumbs up? Let's know you're back. Let's see how many people are now with us. Okay, thank you, Ma. Pastor Mrs. Thank you, Dr. Ken. Anyone who is back, just give us a thumbs up. Let's know you're back. Okay, thank you. Brashegun is there. Dr. Lubem is there. Dr. Okore, Bro Jeremiah, Dr. Fambi. Okay, good. Thank you very much, sirs and ma. Thank you, Dr. Paul. I think we have almost everyone back, so that's good. We can move on, sir. You are still muted. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So welcome back from the break. So before the break, we looked at data collection, data processing, and informed consent. Now for the next 20 minutes or 25 minutes, I'll be looking at specific areas of data protection, particularly CCTV policy, photos, videos, and live streaming, and gift aid. So I'll be looking at, and of course, I'll end up by talking about data retention, how long you can retain the data. Now, of course, from the start, we have to say that you're not required to retain the data indefinitely, right? So there's like a 6 years limit within which you have to retain the data. But we will talk about that as we proceed. So I'll now return to share my screen. Let's see, share the screen here. Okay, so we will now be looking at the CCTV policy under the data protection regulations. Let me just make it. What we have to cover from this point onward is not as detailed as the earlier parts, because we're just looking at specific policies here. So CCTV policy. First of all, I'm not sure if does the church have like CCTV like inside and outside?
I don't think so at our current facility. I don't think so, but there will be plans for that in the new facility we're moving to.
There are CCTV in our current facility, both outside and inside. Yeah.
We have.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Sir.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah. So which makes this discussion quite relevant, because lots of organizations don't know that there are specific legal regulations where an organization uses CCTV in its premises. Okay, so let's look at what the GDPR requirements are for the church since it has CCTV. First of all, under the law, there must be clear signage that the CCTV being used. So at the church premise, so probably on the wall, somewhere where it is very visible, not in some obscure area, it must be clearly visible to everyone attending the building that the CCTV recording ongoing. So the purpose is, again, informed consent, to say that there's CCTV here and you are being recorded, right? So everything that is transpiring here is being recorded. But usually what most organizations do is they try to be clever, as in they would state that CCTV is here for your security and safety. Most people feel safe to know that, everything that is transpiring here is being recorded. So if something goes wrong, we can always, request for it. But the minimum requirement under the law is that signage to show that CCTV recording is ongoing. Usually you can just put for security and safety, but you must inform people. Secondly is members must have access, the access to the recording must be limited to authorized personnel. Why? Data protection, of course, because by recording those coming in and out, that's their personal information. The fact that they attended is personal to them. So it's the black box or whatever recording device where the footage is being recorded must be strictly limited to authorized personnel. So persons who have need need for it. So usually it will be the security team if there's any, but at the very minimum, it must be the DPO. So when I say DPO, I don't mean Oga DPO in Nigerian police station. I mean the data protection officer. So we call them DPOs. So the DPOs must have access to the footage. Now, it has happened on several occasions where maybe a crime has occurred, and then the police have contacted the church to say we want recording of what transpired. The church cannot say, well, we don't know who has access to it. So so there must be the usual go-to person for the church would be to direct them to contact the DPO, because the DPO should be one person who must have access to all the recordings, files, all the data protection materials. Now, when it comes to retention, that's a tricky part, because unless the church maybe spends money on a very large storage device, most organizations can only afford a storage device that stores this information for a short time. So the law doesn't require you to retain it indefinitely or 6 years, like with other information. But usually, we recommend that it is retained for at least 30 days. And that's because usually with the way CCTV operates, you have to, it automatically deletes, older recordings in order to record new ones. So that's fine. So, but the church should have a storage device that is large enough to hold the recording for at least 30 days. And that's because, as we would see later, this recording or this footage can be requested by the police, by the authorities, or even by members, right? So members have the right to, for legitimate reasons, to request for the footage. But so ideally, we would recommend that it is stored for at least 30 days. Okay, so let's talk about specific issues that churches face when they use CCTV. Now, of course, services would often be recorded by CCTV or whatever recording devices, and this is important for things like live streaming, right? That is fine, and as part of it, you will capture the members' images, different forms. You have members who are in the spirit. Sometimes they are not as coordinated as you would think. Maybe someone is under the anointing and the person is responding as the person has been under the anointing. Later, if the person were to watch that footage, the person may feel slightly embarrassed, kind of things like that. So it's important that the recording is, as I said, is limited to only authorized personnel. So it's the recording can be for live streaming or generally for security purposes. And many members may not realize that the CCTV is capturing them, for whatever reason. So for all of these purposes, it's important that the CCTV recording is very strictly monitored by the DPO and others involved. Okay. Now, let's talk about how some members feel, and I'm trying to be practical here, right? That, most people, when they go into a bank, for instance, they expect to be recorded by CCTV when they go into an office. But church, some people feel like a church is a private, solemn place where they can just feel safe and the rest. Now, having some form of surveillance over them may be a challenge for some members, right? I won't lie, the first time I went to a church where I saw a CCTV, I felt a bit uneasy to say, well, it almost feels like an office or a bank. But yeah, so it may help sometimes to make it clear to members that, look, the CCTV is, I mean, not as if you need to announce it generally, but at least for members who raise, maybe any form of concerns, just to advise them that it's mostly for safety and security benefits, and there are safeguards in place, such as access being limited to only authorized personnel. So that would assure members that, look, their privacy is protected. Even though the church has to do what it has to do, it has to have some form of recording and storage of this information. So now, the first thing is there's no legal obligation on the church to use CCTV, right? There's no obligation, but it's advisable to use CCTV. Why? For several reasons. One, enhanced security. Now, you may think, well, it's a church. What could go wrong? A lot could go wrong. It's human beings that attend the church, right? Things go wrong. I've had several cases where we have assault and battery, and the police have actually charged people for fighting in church. Things like that. So a crime could really go on, could go wrong, or sometimes it could even spot things like theft. Yes, believe it or not, people steal in church. The church is like a gathering point of both saints and sinners, right? So people steal. So imagine a member has come to say, look, my phone was on the chair beside me. I can't find it anymore. How do you solve that? You just go to the CCTV footage and watch the recording around that event, and you would see whoever stole it. And now, I'm not going into this because we had this issue before. I think that was last year, where someone was caught stealing in church by the CCTV, and the pastor was like, "Do we report him to the police? Or do we pray for him?" That there's this bottom line between, he did mention about the two sinners who were hung on the cross with Jesus. One was a thief or something like that. That should the church, just pray for him and handle order, or do the church have a legal obligation to report him to the police? That's a tricky one, and it's not within my area, within as what I'm covering today. But it's important. At least you find out who has stolen. You recover the stolen items. So security, monitoring, evidence collection, all of these are the reasons why a church should have CCTV, and I'm glad that they currently have at Rccg. The only concern for us would then be, how do you manage the data protection regulation, which is what I have briefly covered. So what are the practical steps that the church can take to comply? One, you should install signs at the entrances of the church to let members know that the CCTV recording ongoing, and it must be very visible. And as I've said, usually organizations put CCTV in operation for security purposes. So members feel more assured that it's there not to surveil them, it's actually to prevent crime, or at least to monitor and ensure their safety. Now, usually we would always advise that the church, just like every other organization, creates what we call a CCTV policy. It's something that we have samples of templates of, which I can provide if the church needs it, but it outlines the purpose of the CCTV, the detention record, and access rights which members can have if they need to. So these are all the documentation that the church needs to put in place. Just in the event that, and the Charity Commission is doing something recently. They sometimes contact charities to say, let's have your data protection policies, right? Let's see what you have on ground. So it's not at that point the church will begin to then run around to say, what policy do we have? So these are part of the policy documents that you then submit to the Charity Commission to say, look, we are fully compliant. These are our policies on images, on CCTV, on this, on that. So it's something that the church needs to work on, and of course inform members. Now, usually we don't advise churches to announce it to the church and to the church to say, oh, we're actually still recording. It just feels a bit awkward, right? From a practical perspective, usually we just say, look, so long as the sign at the entrance is visible, members know this is recorded. There's no need to further make it awkward for them. But it's all up to to the leadership to see how, if they plan to communicate it separately to the members. That is a policy that the church itself would have to decide. Okay, so that's for CCTV. Let's look at gift aid. Now, gift aid is important because at the end of the day, it's finances, right? It's an important financial issue for the church. So first of all, what is gift aid? Now, I won't spend so much time here because I want to believe for the leadership, you mostly know about what gift aid is. But just to provide some brief explanation for those who are not too familiar with it. So gift aid is a way of promoting charities, is a way of encouraging charities to carry out their activities. It's actually a legal policy. So it allows, the purpose of gift aid is it allows charities to reclaim tax on donations, right? So donations which are made by members, it allows other charities to reclaim tax on it. And that's one important way for increasing funds for charities. The only thing is, unlike the typical African offering, tithes and offering, where you just anonymously put 20 pounds in the offering box, that won't suffice, right? And so in this case, the donors will have to provide their name, address, and tax status, just so HMRC can document these things as part of the church, reclaiming tax on it. But that then raises the point that if the members have to indicate their name, address, and tax status, those are personal information, those are personal data. So it's not the gift aid per se that comes under data protection issues. It's the information that the members have to disclose in order for the church to be able to claim gift aid. So that's why we are discussing this under data protection, because they're inseparable. Gift aid and data protection become inseparable because of the information that have to be disclosed. As I did mention, where members just put offering in the offering box, there's no data protection issues involved, right? Because no one knows who has kept £10 or £5, so there's no personal information. So what are the practical steps that the church can use now? One is it is always important that the church uses HMRC's standard gift aid declaration form. I don't know the current form that the church use, or if they use it. I think the last time I was there, the last time I was in Exeter was in 2019, I think. So I don't know how. Have I been to Exeter before? No, I think that's the last time. So I don't know how the gift aid form is, but if it's not in accordance with HMRC's standard aid declaration form, gift aid declaration form, it's something that the church will have to work on, even if it means revising the form. We have this declaration form in case you want me to provide it. So it's important to train the finance team on data handling, which is my key concern here, about the information obtained from this gift aid form. How is it handled? And you have to regularly audit the records for accuracy. Now, sorry, I think I missed. Yeah, I think I mixed this up. Okay, so let's look at church-specific issues when it comes to data protection. Now, so it's always important that you inform members before they fill those forms, right? You let them know that, look, by providing their information there, the information will be stored. That's the key concern here. It's not that they're giving money, but the fact that the information that they have to provide will have to be stored by the church as part of, so not just stored, but processed. So processed means use it as part of reclaiming the gift aid. So, and as I said, it's very common in African churches for a lot of this information to be shared informally, but by using this gift aid form, it obviates this problem because the information is then written down. But just make sure, and in the standard form, there's always a place for consent, to say you consent to this information being shared. Now, but the last point there about donor privacy goes beyond just gift aid. What happens where, and I know this is something that most African churches do, let's say we're trying to raise funds for an event, right? Usually we have people donating. You have people say, no, I will donate £1,000, I'll donate £5,000, outside of the gift aid there. Now, as I said, it's a common African church practice, and that's absolutely fine. But just like the prayer request and testimony point, is that the church will have to streamline that kind of donation process to be sure that members explicitly consent to their information being disclosed. So if a member wants to publicly announce that he's donating this amount, that's fine. But before he does that, it's important that there's a process whereby he's informed about the fact that by disclosing this, his information is being shared to others, and he consents to that. So usually, most churches these days, especially UK churches, they are going through a formal written declaration process for donation. So outside of the gift aid, where if a member wants to donate, he has to fill a form, state the amount he donates, and then there's a column where they ask whether he or she wants his information to be divulged or not. He can sign on the relevant form. So if a member wants the information to be divulged, then so that's the consent that has been obtained, and then you can thank the donor by name. I mean, some people do it for show off. We're all human beings, right? Some people want it to be known that they donated £5,000. Let's be honest, £5,000 is a lot of money. If I had to donate £5,000, I probably would want it to be known. So some people want it to be known. That's fine, so long as they consent to it. So that's where the donation form comes in. So the person would consent to say, look, I want my information to be known, so that before the pastor or any church leader announces that, oh, let's all thank Brother John, he has donated £5,000 for our new church building. Yes, that is good, but just make sure you've obtained his consent in advance before you do that. So normally we ask for formal written declarations from church members. Okay, now let's talk about the tax implications when it comes to gift aid. I won't go into the tax implications per se, but the key thing here is just to try and make sure that the church members understand the tax implication by completing the gift aid form, because most church members are not used to it, especially in the African context. We're not used to writing that, how much that we are given. So, but by providing clear, simple explanation that this is the reason why this is important, it helps to encourage more members to do gift aid. And of course, you also have to address their privacy concern. That yes, we're going to store the information, but this information is private. It will only be used for legitimate purposes, and then highlight the importance of how gift aid benefits the church. So it helps the church to reclaim a lot of tax from HMRC. So that's something that the church would have to consider. Okay, so I'm running a bit out of time, so I won't spend so much time on this. I would just I would provide the slide after the session. But let's look at in terms of storage, retention period, because when this gift aid forms are completed and submitted, then the data protection obligation kicks in. First of all, what is the purpose for using that gift aid form? Must be for a legitimate purpose, and legitimate purpose here will have to be solely for tax reclaims. So do not use it for marketing or other purposes, which is why I said that the church would have to, if it wants to have a different donation process where members donate for an event or for maybe church building, it has to have a separate donation process, so that in that case you can say, oh, this member has donated £5,000. But gift aid, it has to be used solely for tax reclaims, not for marketing or other purposes, separate from the donation form, which can be used for marketing. In terms of retention, how do you retain it? It must be retained for at least 6 years. And I would look at that very briefly. I'm coming on to that. It must be retained for at least 6 years. So the physical form that they have filled and submitted, of course, as I said, it must be stored securely. So there must be filing cabinets where these things are stored, and you can scan it and put it electronically in an encrypted system. That's something that can also be done. But in terms of retention, it has to be retained for 6 years. Why? Because if I made a gift aid donation 4 years ago and I've left the church, let's say I'm having a tax issue with HMRC, and I say, look, I actually even did gift aid. I'm entitled to contact Rccg and say, look, the gift aid form I filled 4 years ago, I want a copy of it. It's my personal data. I want it. Rccg must be able to provide it. Otherwise, that will be a problem. So it's about storage and retention as when it comes to gift aid. Okay, let's briefly look at online live streaming and videoing. Now, this is something that most churches do, and it's absolutely fine. The only concern is awareness of the members. Members must be aware, and I'm sure most churches do this. So it's one area that I think most churches are up to speed on. So you have to let members know about the fact that the session is being live streamed, and educate them on the importance of it. Any member who says, I don't want to be shown in a live streaming, and we've had that a few times for some of our clients. The question for the church is, how do you handle it? So you have two members sitting on the front row who says, I don't want to show in the in the recording. How do you handle it? That's a real big challenge. So what we tell the church is, if you have members who don't want to be shown, then you have to explain to them that they have to sit in a certain section of the hall, so that you can then direct the camera team to avoid showing that section. Because otherwise, if they're sitting in front, how are you going to do it? Unless you want to blur them out, you can do that, but it's not the tidiest thing to do. So those are some of the challenges. But usually, our advice is, you can, if a member says, I don't want to be shown, you can then have a dedicated section where those members can see it, and then the camera would not cover those areas. Simply, right? So we have sample consent forms, which we also draft for churches who need that. Usually, you wouldn't need that to be signed every single time. You actually don't even need the form per se. Sometimes it's enough to just notify the members that it's been recorded and it's been live streamed, and any member who has an objection should contact the pastor or any of the leadership team, and that objection would be taken into consideration. Okay, so the common uses for live streaming would involve broadcasting live church services, choir events, drama, but most importantly for churches these days is social media posts, right? So most churches are active on Facebook and sometimes even Instagram. You actually need these live streaming platforms to propagate the church. So that's absolutely fine. Again, it just comes down to informed consent, data processing. How do you use the photos and videos after you've obtained them, which is what we are looking at now. To say you can share it on Facebook, on Instagram, on WhatsApp. You can. The important thing is consent. Once again, right? Consent. Any member who says, I don't want to be shown, you have to ensure that the video or the thing is edited to not show that member, right? But as I said, for live streaming, the consent would always be capturing non-consenting and attendees. And we've had clients who have contacted us about it, and we said, look, you then have to have a section of the church where non-consenting attendees can stay, so that you don't capture them. So that's something that you can consider. The practical step would be to create the consent forms. You can announce it before services, but usually we just say if you have a way of informing the members without just before service saying, oh, we're going to live stream this, do you consent or not? It just feels a bit awkward, right? So those are some practical issues that the church will have to iron out, but you don't literally have to have everybody sign before church to say I consent to it. No, so long as you've informed them in advance. And usually what we advise is, as part of the membership form, the members should be notified that by attending church services, please note that the photos and videos are live streamed. If you consent to it, sign here. If you don't consent, sign here, so that we then have a list in advance of members who don't want to be shown in photos and videos. We have other members who are happy with it. So it helps from a logistics point of view, right? But that's something that the church would have to work out. But that's like practical advice that we give to embed it in the membership forms. So so that it can help for your logistics. And even social media posts, so long as members have consented to being recorded and you've notified them that the recording will be put on social media and the rest, and they all consent to it, or at least nobody objects to it, then that is absolutely fine. Finally, very briefly, we'll look at data retention. So after all of the data that you have collected, how long do you have to retain them? Now, under the law, so long as a person is a member, you must retain the data of that member. Now, after the person leaves, you must retain it for 1 to 2 years, a maximum of 2 years, right? Now, generally, the law says you should retain every information for at least 6 years. So what happens if a person is a member for 2 years? that means you will then apply the generic law of 6 years, right? So you have to keep it for 6 years. But if the person is a member for longer than 6 years, then you have to keep it for as long as the person is a member plus an additional 1 to 2 years. So those are things that we have to bear in mind. Gift aid, strictly speaking, has to be for 6 years after the last donation. Safeguarding records when it has to do with children, that is an entirely different thing altogether. Now, it doesn't mean information of children. No, it means if there are any safeguarding issues that arose regarding a child, that has to be kept almost for eternity. As you can see, there's 75 years for as long as possible because safeguarding issues are in a specific class of their own. CCTV footage has to be stored for, as I said, for a minimum of 30 days, usually because it could be needed for an investigation. However, if you're contacted by a public body saying we need a particular footage, then you have to retain it for as long as is necessary. So the summary of it is that in terms of retention, the general rule is information should be retained for 6 years. Right now, but there are different time limits. So long as the person is a member, you must retain their information. After they leave, you have to retain it for 1 to 2 years. Gift aid is 6 years. Safeguarding records is 75 years. CCTV footage, you can just keep it for 30 days. Okay, so the point is, despite these legal timelines, usually churches keep records indefinitely, right, for as long as possible. But what we have just covered is the minimum period that the law requires, right? But the church must have a policy on record retention in order to prevent breaches. And that policy should reflect the minimum period by law so that members are clear. Any member who wants to view the policy is clear that my data will be preserved for at least 6 years. Now, if I stay longer than 6 years in the church, it will be preserved for as long as I'm a member. And after I leave, it will still be preserved for 1 to 2 years afterwards. So you must have that clear policy on it. Now, paper records are quite common, but as we said, they are very vulnerable to fire, to being misplaced and the rest. So the church may have to consider, using electronic recorded. So, like for instance, the membership form, you can scan them and upload them on a cloud service, which the church has. Not only does it help for protecting the data, but it helps for ease of access. So, for instance, if the pastor wants to check the membership list, he doesn't have to physically go and look for the form. He could just sign into the church cloud platform, and access the membership list. Of course, that platform will have to be strictly limited to persons who have authorization to access it. Okay, so when it comes to data protection overall, we say that data retention. We say first of all, you create a data retention policy. And then when it's time to dispose of it, you should securely dispose of it. So if it's physical copy, you should shred it. They have shredding. If it's digital copies, you should delete it securely, not just click on the delete button. Sometimes it goes into the recycle bin. So you should completely delete it securely, and you should regularly audit your records to be sure that you're not keeping outdated data. Persons who were members in 2010, this is 2025. It's 14 years already. Why are you still keeping that? So those are things that you have to radically constantly review. And we have discussed cultural consideration that members expect records to be kept indefinitely, but that's not the law. So you have to, if members request, you explain to them the legal limits. And of course, when it comes to disposal, you make sure you dispose of it properly. So finally, as I said, the key steps for the church is one, to appoint a DPO, to develop clear policies for data protection, to train the leaders. This session is part of the training, and then to engage members, to always inform members about their policies. This can be put on their website, on a social media platform. You could have privacy notices displayed, and whatever steps that the church deem necessary. So the key takeaways are, as I've identified, data protection principle, the essential practices, and to ensure that the cultural practices we have as Africans, align with GDPR regulations. It's very important because we are still Africans, at least most of us are, but we still have to ensure that as a church we comply with the UK law on data protection. Okay, so that is me done. I know I've taken you through quite a lot. So this will be time for questions. Yeah, please. I don't know who is going to organize it in terms of who
Thank,
asks what, or you could just ask randomly.
thank you very much, sir. It's time for questions, and a couple of questions have come in, and I've
Okay,
seen somebody's hand. So let's start with Dr. Olubemi, whose
okay,
hand is up, and then I'll come back to. There are some questions I have from some of us. I'll come back to them. So, Doctor,
okay.
Okay, so sorry, I have a few questions here.
Yes,
So the first one has to do with the first time attendee forms.
yes.
Um, do you think that these need to stipulate the phrase membership form?
No, it doesn't have to.
Okay.
Because what the law, because the church is a charity, it is required to have a list of members, right?
Yeah.
So, but the how it collects the membership is not regulated by law, right? So, first time attend because, and it's an important question that you've asked. A person may attend the church but not want to be a member. Right? Let's
Yeah.
say I visit a new city and my brother takes me to church. It doesn't mean I have to become a member of that church. So
Yeah.
if you calculate membership form, the person will be like, well, I don't want to be a member, I'm just attending today. Right? So usually the first time form can translate into a membership form if the person wants to remain a member. So usually what we do when we advise churches on this is that there should be a column somewhere on that form whether the person wants to be a member of the church. Because some people just visit one off and leave. That doesn't transform them into members.
And then the second one that pertains to that is, would you advise that, say, perhaps old members who never signed first timer forms should sign an updated form?
Yes, that's and I believe I did mention it somewhere in my presentation that the challenge is for some old members. I mean, for some old members who never signed a membership form. The question is, how do you obtain their consent to some of these things? Now, practically, the church may consider a new process whereby the church says, look, all members are required to complete some forms. You could distribute these forms through WhatsApp or something, just for all members to sign and return back to the church. So that way the church can embed most of these policies. That form can then indicate clearly the data protection policies and the rest. So don't just say for old members, you can make it for all members, right?
Yeah.
As I said, that moving forward, the new members, then you then have that form for new members, right?
Yeah.
But you can just do it. So that's one way we advise. But there might be different ways that the church can approach it. But yes, the advice is old members should have to sign an updated form in some ways.
And then the other question I have is about testimony time.
Yes.
I'm just thinking about how to sort of streamline the process of consenting without making it cumbersome. So I was just thinking, do you think it might suffice, say, for example, if a simple announcement stating that by participating in testimony time, that by implication the person is consenting to their data being shared?
Okay. Legally speaking, no, that will not suffice. Why? Because an announcement doesn't amount to consent, right? I did mention this earlier, that simply telling the person by doing this you are consenting. You are simply informing the person. You're not getting the person's consent. You may say, well, by the person coming out, the person is impliedly consenting, but that's a very tricky point to. I mean, yeah, you can argue that consent by conduct, but we always advise against that. What we say is, every Sunday, the church should have like a form where members who want to give testimony should indicate their name,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And on that form, you then have it clearly there that by doing this, you are consenting to this. If you consent, tick yes or tick this thing. So that's an explicit consent by the member. It's risky to rely on implied consent, right? That's an assumption.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
always have a list of members who want to give testimony, have them tick. And it's not cumbersome. It's just saying, you can announce it as a policy that henceforth, any member who wants to give testimony at the start of the church, please meet Sister this to to write your name. So they will see it as writing their name, but after writing their name, there will be a column where they have to sign to say, yes, that's it. It's not cumbersome.
Exactly.
And then you retain that form for 6 years, so that if any day the person says, oh, I gave testimony and this was used against me, you bring the form to say, look, you signed that you're consenting. Not, well, you came out, that means you agreed. That's a very risky argument to make.
The last question, sorry, folks. The last question I have is about live streaming of the program. So we have a lot of scenarios where people come in late into church, including first timers. So assuming a live streaming is already going on, the guys, he salters into church at about 11:30.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Now that is a tricky one. What we can do, I mean, the truth is you can't really visit every single scenario, right? What we can do is, and we've advised a couple of churches on this, that you have ushers at the entrance, right? So when a member is coming in late, there's like this short form that they give them, right? So on that form is saying that live streaming is ongoing and your information may be recorded. If you object to this, please let the usher know, right? They don't have to read it there. It's just like a small, short business card form they just issued to them. So when they sit down, they look at it and they know that live streaming is ongoing. If they have an objection, they can stand up and tell the usher, I don't want to be recorded. So that's one practical solution. You know, there are different ways you can handle it, but it's always safer to get their consent, or at least to inform them about live streaming ongoing without disrupting the ongoing service.
Thank you so much. That's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. There is also a question I'd like to just, a clarification actually, when you were talking about the CCTV policy. So someone is asking, is there an obligation if the facility is a rented facility and the CCTV equipment have been installed by the owner of the facility and the church is only renting it?
Okay, that's a very good question. Now, that happens quite often. The question would be, who has access to the recording of the CCTV? Is it the landlord, or does the church have the access to the recording itself? That would determine my answer.
Dr. Ken, if you can clarify, please.
We don't have, if we want it, we can have access, but it's actually being managed by the facility owner themselves.
Okay, well, that is fine. So in that case, the person who manages the CCTV is the one who has the obligation to comply with the CCTV policy. So it's not the church in that case, it's the landlord or the facilities manager, right? Because, sorry, I didn't cover this because it wasn't particularly relevant at the time, that when we talk about data protection, it's the person, we call them the managers of data. So if, as a church, if you're collecting data, you have to manage it. So if the CCTV is being managed by the facilities manager, they are the one collecting the data. So they are the ones that have to manage the CCTV policy. Do you understand? Yeah, so that, I believe that answers the question. But I don't know if the facilities managers allow the church to have its own private recordings. That's a different question. So if the church were to install some additional video, or maybe just have a videographer in the church, for instance, that becomes the church collecting that data, and the church then becomes obliged to manage that data. Do you understand?
Thank you very much, sir.
But one thing, just add one thing that can be done is the church should write to the facilities manager and let them know that this is what they expect about the CCTV recording, right? Just because their members may request for it and the rest too. It's just a simple letter to let the facilities manager know that these records should be maintained for at least 30 days, blah, 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 just in case the church needs access to it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So there are two questions that I want to quickly come to, and then we can open the floor for other people as well. And just to kindly ask us that please, let's be a bit patient. We might spill over the time just for a couple of minutes, but it shouldn't be for too long. So please, let's just be patient so we can cover most important issues. There's a question about evangelism, particularly street evangelism and outreach events. Say, for example, we have gone to High Street. And what steps should we take to ensure compliance with data protection laws, especially regarding members of the public now. How do we handle incidental capture of personal data? Somebody who is just going around on night street and will capture the person, or those kind of situation.
That's a good question. The answer there is that it cuts across into a slightly different area of law. For instance, if I'm walking down the street, I can take a video in the street, and it's not data protection concerns, right? Because it's a public, so long as you're in a public sphere, right, and you capture people passing by, there's really no data protection concern per se, except that that recording should be stored for 6 years, right? And you can use it for outreach and the rest, because anyone who is in the public cannot say, well, I don't want to be captured. You're in the public, you're in the public square, you're in Trafalgar Square. People are doing evangelism. If you don't want to be captured, you don't go to the evangelism place. Do you understand? It's different from where someone comes to a church. That becomes a private setting. Do you understand? So for evangelism, there's no real data protection concern where you are in a public sphere and people are passing and the rest. But usually what some people try to do is they try to have like a poster, right? Somewhere around there, as in to say, please note that images and videos are being captured and maybe used for social media purposes, right? So it's just having a couple of posters around just to let members of the public know. But it's because if someone is passing by, you don't know the person's name, do you? Now, if you collect the person's name, you are then collecting data, private personal data, right? Then the obligation on you to manage it arises. But if you just capture members of the public walking by, I mean, you see that in the news, when you're watching a news broadcast, you see people passing by up and down, right? They won't tell them, sorry, and do you consent to me capturing your image? No, they don't do that because it's a public setting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
There is also this very relevant and practical one. If the church is accused of breaching data protection regulations, what immediate steps should we take to respond appropriately and within the law? What are the reporting duties and remediation procedures under UK GDPR policy?
Now that is a lengthy question, which would have to do with like detailed advice, but I would summarize it this way. Now, if there's an accusation against the church for data breach, the first thing that the church has to do is to produce its data protection policies, right? To say this is our policy involved. Now, the alleged breach, the church would then have to produce its record of that personal information and then show how it has managed the information, which is why I did emphasize throughout that there's need for record keeping for cases like that. So if there's an allegation, what would the church defense would be its record keeping, to say this is all the record we have, these are the policies we have, this is the processing requirements that we implement. But usually, if the allegation comes from the Charity Commission, the church would most likely have to hire a lawyer, right? Because you will have to respond formally to the Charity Commission. But even as a church, the main step the church can take is to produce its policies, its record, and its processing requirements for review. And once everything has been done properly, the church should be fine. Otherwise, that could be a problem. But even at that, because you mentioned remediation, we've had a couple of churches that have run foul of it. Actually, it was a couple of members that actually complained. So members can get the church into trouble, right? So what we then advise for remediation is an undertaking. The church can give an undertaking to say, look, we admit failing in this area, but these are the steps that we're taking to address these points moving forward. Most times, the Charity Commission or the ICO, we call them ICO, Information Commissioner, and because usually when there's data breach allegation, it involves either the Charity Commission, because the church is a charity, and the ICO, who is the Information Commissioner, right? So it's to give an undertaking that we admit failings in this area, and but these are the steps that we're taking to remediate those problems. And usually the ICO and Charity Commission would accept it unless it's a very serious breach, right? Then there may be talks of compensation. I did mention that one of our clients got compensation of over £10,000 from his school for data breach. So, but I've not seen a church be ordered to pay. Usually it's just a recommendation for the church to do this and do that and do this.
Thank you very much, sir. There is also a question about opt-in and opt-out. How can we
Yes.
use that effectively?
But I would want more information. Opt-in and opt-out from what? Okay, is it just generally how to opt into data processing and opt out of it? So, Joel,
Dr. Joel,
I think,
can you
Joel,
clarify, sir?
yeah, I'm not sure exactly.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for the explanation, the lecture so far. No, most of the time you have this opt-in, opt-out, which are used either in research or in form of consenting to data, as you have been explaining.
Yeah.
I mean, when you opt in, this means that you are saying that you are allowed to participate in that particular program.
Yeah.
And also when you opt out, you are saying that, no, I don't want to be part of it.
Part of it
So
again.
the question is that how can we now use that simple phrase, opt in or opt out, in this situation for people to know that they are already part of this data? I mean, they are already part of consenting to their data being processed or being used or opting out.
Okay. That's a good question. The answer would be, it's not just about using opt-in and opt-out. It's about the process itself. So the opt-in should be part of any form that the member has to fill, right? To say I am opting into this. Similarly, the opt-out, there has to be an opt-out form. It's simple and straightforward opt-out form. So in any form where you have an opt-in process, you must indicate there that a member can opt out by filling a particular form which they can request for, right? So it's not just telling them, oh, but you're opting in, you're opting out. They have to actively be given the opportunity to fill a form particularly for opting out, because opting in can be part of the membership form, for instance. That's quite straightforward. But to opt out, they have to take some steps to say, I want to opt out of it. So it's for the church to determine, based on the specific activity involved, how they want to design the opt-out process. Usually just any simple form to say, I hereby withdraw my consent to being recorded or to my information being shared, signed, date, that's it, right? So it's about the process that the church takes. And for opt-out particularly, it's important that there's a form or at least some form of documentation that the member can fill to say I'm opting out. Sorry, does
Thank
that
you
answer
very
the
much, sir.
question?
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Do we have any questions again from anyone? Maybe you want to raise your hand or put it in the chat box. There are some questions I have here, but
Okay.
I'm just going through them and I see that you've covered many of them already. That's why I'm just scanning through them. But if anybody has any other question on what you've not covered, we can quickly give the room. Okay. There's a question in the chat box, sir.
Is there a need? Okay, sorry. Let me read the question. Is there a need for the church to obtain strict permission from the council to cover her activities during period of evangelism, as this may be on the public, particularly where recordings were made to capture the public who may be listening or watching? Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. If the church wants to carry out evangelism in a public atmosphere, it's important that the church obtain, I won't call it permission, is to notify the council, really, right? Notify the council, because it's a public sphere, right? And it's open to the public, but it's to notify the council about the intention to do this, and also address in the notification, inform them of the steps that the church would take to ensure data protection, that information collected from members of the public will be processed in accordance with the GDPR regulations. There will be efforts made to minimize the scope of persons captured in the videos and recordings. Just basic standard legal gibberish that we are saying as we call it. But yes, absolutely, it's important that the council is notified in advance to avoid any awkward situations. And yeah, that's the so when you say strict permission, I mean, again, it may depend on the council regulations. I know in Yorkshire here and in most other areas for clans I've handled, so long as it's a public fair and it's not a council building, you can literally just go there and do evangelism. All you need to do is to notify the council. But I don't know if Exeter Council, they may have regulations about it's something that I can look into because we provide more, bespoke advice when we have to look into the regulations for that particular council. So there may be that Exeter City Council or Devon. I'm not sure which one is the council. Maybe Devon or Exeter. I'm not sure how it works. Yeah. So there may be that there's a specific regulations for that council about obtaining permission. But for most other councils, you simply have to notify them in advance and then inform them of the steps you would take to ensure safety. Mostly they're more concerned about safety and security, but usually you also address data protection. Okay, I can see another question. Say, what are the proper the proper procedures for securely storing, accessing, and transferring members' personal data, particularly when individuals require access? How can we ensure confidentiality, integrity, and accountability? Well, that is really the task of the DPO. As I said, in terms of, let me address each one. Storing, in terms of storing, you are required to store it electronically most times. You can store it if you're storing it physically, the requirement is that you must have a secure file cabinet. So not just a drawer where the things are kept, but that drawer must be fireproof. Usually we advise on a fireproof cabinet, which with specific lock. And keys are only available to authorized members. So that's for storage. If it's electronically, we advise, instead of using a USB, for instance, or a hard drive, we advise you use a cloud service where it can be stored on a cloud platform, and then only specific people have access to that platform. And then for accessing it, it's about what do we call it? Authorized persons. So if it's cloud services, you provide password to authorized persons. If it's physical cabinets, the keys should only be available to authorize the persons. But in terms of access by members, so if members want to access their personal data, it is their right to do so under the GDPR. You should have a form where members can fill and submit to the leadership or any the pastor or church leaders to say, I want this specific data. So once that form is filled, the DPO will then process the form and determine if the information is available, if it's something that they can disclose, or if it's something that there's other confidentiality concerns about it. For instance, if the person requesting the information is not the owner of that information, is not the owner of the data, then you would need the consent of the owner to divulge it. So those are issues around storing, accessing, transferring. When it comes to transferring, it's simple process of if it's physically, do you want to transfer it physically? If it's electronically, those are more of the nitty-gritties that we will have to train the DPO, or that the DPO will have to be trained on how to handle these things. It's not something we can cover in detail in this session.
Thank you very much, sir. Going through the list of questions that I have on my screen that were sent and compiled, you've touched on everything already. The first four of it, thankfully, Dr. Olubemi just picked on them in his question. So we've covered those already, and I've read out the other ones. At this point, if we do not have any further questions, I guess I don't know if there's a final thoughts or final comments from you, Dr. Paul, but if not, then we might just, at this point, appreciate you. Do you have any final comments just before we do that?
Well, all I would say is thank you for the opportunity, but I also want to emphasize that in all of these data protection concerns, we also have to be mindful as a church of the overall goal of the church being to promote Christianity and maintain trust and confidence in the members. So in implementing these policies, we should try not to make it too cumbersome, or we should try not to make it too awkward for the members, because most of them, they're Africans, they still have the African mentality, and there's normally this resistance to like deeply held cultural values. So it's that delicate balance that the church would have to comply with its legal obligations, but at the same time to ensure that they respect cultural sensitivity. So my final thought would be that don't try to move suddenly into data protection, like go completely obsessed with it. It will probably create some friction. Is that there might be need for this gradual, implementation of policies, such that the members don't feel like, wow, what's happening? Everything has just changed overnight. We now have to fill form every day, things like that. That could be off-putting. So normally we ask for a transition period of around 3 to 6 months, where the church gradually transitions into, better data protection policies. It could mean introducing one policy at a time, gradually moving towards the targeted goal. But that's what my final thought would be on.
That's a great idea. Thank you so much. Dr. Olubemi has a question.
Yeah.
I was going to come back to him to also help us do the final vote of thanks anyway. So, Doctor, please go ahead, sir.
Right. So it's just been great to have this talk, and I assume that the appropriate admin would be taking note about information that's necessary to add to the first timer attendance form, which I suspect might need to be updated to capture some of the things that you have shared. Really, thank you so much for what you've shared with us. I mean, this has just been an eye-opener in many levels. I mean, as you know, I would say our Africanism is deeply ingrained, and unfortunately, most of us have never really had the opportunity of attending non-African churches in developed countries, so as to broaden our understanding of even basic church practices in these settings. So that compromises, us quite significantly, I think. It does. So our mindset is such that, we're prone and vulnerable to some of these laws. We look at them lightly and we don't take them seriously enough. Yeah. So Dr. Abba, we're really very grateful for your time and all the effort you've put in, and your expertise and your willingness to continually support us in the journey. Thank you so much.
Glad you found it enlightening.
Thank you so much. All right. At this point, for every one of us, we're closing the call now, but just as we're doing that, if you want to open your mic to say thank you, or you want to react with a thumbs up or a clap just to appreciate Dr. Abba, now is the time to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abba.
Thank you very much.
Much appreciated.
No problem. I'm happy to have been invited, and I look forward to meeting some of you maybe next time I'm in Exeter.
We look forward to having you around. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Abba, on behalf of my husband as well.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I thought it's been a long time.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
Okay. All right, then. Cheers.
And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to attend the training. Like Doctor said, I've noted down a couple of things that we need to address, and then we'll just make sure we disseminate that across the different teams that are responsible for some of this data, and we can begin to update the forms that we use. We would also be contacting you. Dr. Ken had just reached out to me about some things that we'd like to discuss with you, and some of those things you've said we can discuss with you about. So we'll be contacting you after later on those points. So God bless you so much.
Pastor has my contact and I think he has my email, or you can just reach out to me. I'll provide my contact details.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really great to know. Thank you. God bless you.
No problem. Cheers. Have a nice day, everyone. Yeah.
All right, bye everyone. Thank you. God bless you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Yeah, bye.
Thank you.